How do you fix the problem with a city that is no longer growing? And I'm going to use the example of New York City. When I first lived in New York City, you did not see any buildings on the Jersey side except maybe one. Now there are tons of buildings on the Jersey side, such as Hoboken, East New York, Liberty. I don't know if it's called Liberty in Jersey. And you can see tons of big buildings on the New Jersey side. So the question is, how do you keep a city growing? You can see these geniuses came up with the amazing idea of building buildings on the grass instead of on the parking lot. Wow, give these people all the money because they figured out the solution. Well, this is the solution. You basically got to tear down the old buildings and put up new buildings. It's the only way. If you know New York City has a little bit of everything. It has tall buildings that are like 500 floors tall. There are apartment buildings, like I knew people who had apartment buildings that were like 50 stories tall. Mine was five. And there are two-story buildings in New York City. And there are houses in New York City where you can park your car in your driveway. And they're very close together. It's like, let's say I type in Bensonhurst. Okay, that's not what I meant. This is what I'm talking about. All in the family. So you got this style of housing, and the city cannot grow because the buildings are relatively small and there's not enough space. So let's type in New York City. We'll take a look. So you see, we've got a couple tall buildings. I see one over here, and I see one over here, which is called Empire State Building. This one in the middle. And I know you're going to look at that and say, wow, that's a lot of tall buildings. It's really not, because take a look at this picture. This picture shows a big difference. This is taken probably from the Empire State Building. And you can see that there's a lot of short buildings in between. And a lot of these buildings are only 3 stories tall. You got to tear them down and build up anew. In New York, you've got, this is downtown that we're looking at. And then there's Midtown, which is where Empire State Building is. Looks like this is Midtown. I can't. It's hard for me to see. Yeah, that's the Pan Am Building, or I think now it's called the MetLife Building, and you can see Central Park in the background. But as you spread out around the city, like in Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, it's it's not, the buildings are not that tall. And then when you get to Westchester, same thing. Like this is common in Queens. I can tell from looking at it that it's Ridgewood, Queens. And this is Astoria, Queens. I can tell by looking at it. And basically, these buildings at some point are going to have to go. This is not going to be in Manhattan so much, or at least not near the. See, it says Queens because the elevated rail doesn't exist in Manhattan except maybe in the north. And you've got the roads got to go underground. Pretty much everything. It's easy to do. It's not difficult. Oh, now I get it. Now I understand Queens. I get it. I get it. So here's an example where you can see, I don't remember the name of that building. You can see the Empire State Building. This green one over here is probably United Nations. And we've got a bridge over here. Looks like it might be a double-decker bridge. It's got to be 59th Street Bridge. And notice the buildings are very short. And there's lots of trees. You gotta knock all those buildings down. 7 train. Wow, everybody loves to ride the 7 train, right? So the only way to do that is when people are on vacation to go and just knock all the buildings down. You have to somehow find a way to knock those buildings down. And the problem is if you go to some guy and say, hey, I'll give you money for your building, then the guy next door is going to raise the sale price. So to buy out the neighborhood in order to rebuild, It's going to be expensive. If you want to increase the footprint of a building, you're going to have like this. If you want to buy two buildings next to each other, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And I looked into buying a building, and some people they own 100 buildings. You know what they say? They say you got to buy all 100 buildings. They won't sell you just one. You can get just one building in New York City, but often you have to buy more than one because the people that are taking over the world, the communists. I'm going to get banned by YouTube. You know, they're buying up all the buildings. The other issue is let's say this is Queens, and you're going to say no way that can't be Queens. It looks like it's got garbage all over the place. There's parts of New York that are not properly developed. Um, this is says New York City. See the city building? I believe it's this green one, and then the United Nations on the other side is green. I don't know if you can see it. It's a little bit on the left, and then the Empire State Building to the left of that. This is Queens. Look how short the buildings are. All of that, all those buildings need to be torn down and rebuilt, and they're all paying $50 a month in rent because they all have rent control. And you know what? There's empty buildings like the Leona Helmsley building. When I lived there 20 years ago, there were signs up that the building was for sale, and I was told that they will never they allow the buildings to become dilapidated so that they can get out of the rent control, because if the building becomes condemned, they no longer have to be covered by rent control. Leona Helmsley, I believe she was a large property owner in New York City many years ago. And this stuff is cute, but you don't want to give this sort of stuff up. There's so few parks, and this is in Queens. Look at that. Actually, maybe it's in Canada. Back to the seventh grade. What that looks like the United Nations right there too. Empire State Building. I don't know if it is. So because we all love the United Nations. All the good things they're doing in the world right now. So that is how you do it. You got to tear the buildings down, and unfortunately, people say no. And it's like, why would you want to live in a dumpy building? I'm going to put in Harlem. I'm going to tell you, Harlem is actually a little bit more of a quiet neighborhood than other parts of New York. This is what it looked like when I first went to New York City. Every block had abandoned cars. So Harlem looks kind of like this. This is what Harlem looks like. It's not such a bad neighborhood. It's a pretty quiet neighborhood. And the buildings are short, and people are not paying that much in rent. And you got to tear these buildings down. Look at that building, and you're going to see empty lots. You drive around, and you'll see an empty lot where there's no building there. And the government is most in your way of improving the city, because they're going to say, well, you can't build on that empty lot for some dumb reason, or you can't take this building down because it's a historic building. And then obviously, if you're going to take the building down, you're going to allow these people to live in another place. But if you're building a huge building, then problem solved. They're just going to move upstairs, and they're going to get everything brand new. So the other option is you got to build some things underground. The MetLife building has a tunnel, for example. I wonder if that's it. No, that's not it. So the MetLife building, here it is. It's in the middle of the road. These taxis are coming out of a tunnel, and they're going to drive under the MetLife building to get to the other side. There's another tunnel. And there's literally a building. I'm going to show you on the George Washington Bridge. GWB. Let's see if I do GWB building, if it shows it. When you cross the George Washington Bridge, you drive under a building. doesn't show it here. But you live in New York City, you know what I'm talking about. It's on the New York side. Maybe you can see it from here. It's I don't remember what the name of the highway is. It's like 395 or something like that. But when you get off the bridge, there's just a giant building. You go right under it. They could literally put buildings all over the place on the highways. Move the cars underground and leave the top for the people. Now over here, you'll notice that there's space between the piers. Nobody's using that space. This is actually, you see over here how a lot of empty space. It's all empty space. I never see boats over there. It's so rare that you see a boat um, at any of these piers. They're just empty. Fill them in. A lot of New York, like Battery Park, was filled in. This is probably more in the north. Yeah, see, that's the Empire State Building. This is in the north. In the south, it's all empty. Stuff like this would be nice. Well, look at that, Pier 55. This is obviously not good use of space. So that's what you got to do. Yeah, this is shows a lot of the emptiness. I don't know what this area is. Maybe it's Chelsea Piers. I can't really tell. This is Chelsea Piers right here. So you got to tear down the old buildings, reclaim the land, reclamation. It's called the reclamation area, and build buildings over the roads. You probably don't want to build over Central Park. And you're going to have to deal with all the people that are going to be difficult about moving out of their apartment buildings, which means the really only solution is going to be to build thin buildings that are tall. So I will show you an example. You're not going to see an example because you know what? I didn't prepare. Man, what a pain in the butt. So you'd have to build a building like these small ones. These are probably separate buildings. You'll know if they have like a separate entrance. The one on the right looks like one building. And you'd have to take one of these thin buildings and build it really tall, which means it has to have an elevator. These probably don't have elevators. And that's going to be the solution. They're going to be smallish apartments, really tall. These got to be torn down. Okay, so that's how you fix urbanization.